This is the lecture for Monday, what is it?
25th.
25th?
Yeah.
I think it's up here. For Monday, yes, thank you, you smart people. The 25th of October, 2021 for Ancient and Medieval History. Thanks to those who are handing out corrected assignments. What we have been talking about is the origins of culture and civilization. We talked about the scope of a farmer being the hometown unified with the universe, as seen in the night sky. And how this leads to astronomy, or not astronomy, astrology, which is the intuitive belief that events in the heavens reflect those on the earth and vice versa. We talked about the divine, gods, and philosophies, transcendent ideas about meaning that tend to be at the heart of most civilizations, referencing our American civic religion, whose creed is freedom, whose scripture is the Constitution, Federalist Papers, the Declaration of Independence, and whose symbol is the flag. We also talked about legitimacy. Make sure you have your notepacks out, please. Which is the moral right to rule. The sense in everyone's mind that the person in charge is the right person for the job. And it is a good thing, and a right thing, a just thing, and a blessing that this person is the boss of me and you right now. Because if anyone can get us through whatever crisis we're going through, he can. If anyone can keep us alive in these difficult times, he can. And if anyone has been put there by the powers that be to be tested as our leader, it's him. All human societies have some degree of hierarchy. Even the most egalitarian of them have the hierarchy of charisma. Some people are more appealing than others. It's not just a question of physical beauty, it's also a question of wisdom. We are in the notes on item 3, B, the divine, C, legitimacy source. So folding ahead to that point would be a good idea. It's portrait formatted, and you'll see a bunch of qualities of culture and civilization. So, having looked at these things at the heart, let's talk about what a culture is. A culture, here's a definition that you should probably write down. A culture is a group of people who share core beliefs about the meaning of life, the universe, and everything. A culture is a group of people that share core beliefs about the meaning of life, the universe, and everything. A culture is a group of people who share core beliefs, fundamental assumptions, you don't have to write that down, about the meaning of life, the universe, and everything. Core beliefs. These are the kinds of things that are worth living for, dying for, and killing for. So, if you love, although I don't know how many people who actually do, the Seattle Mariners team, even if you're a member of Red Sox Nation, who tend to be the most fanatical baseball fans I know, and I'm a Yankee fan, we don't like the Boston team. They don't like us. That's not a culture. Arguably, it's a subculture, but it's not a culture. People who love Star Trek or Star Wars and don't like the other. People who like dogs but not cats, or cats but not dogs. That's not a culture. Because unless you're dealing with complete psychopaths, and they do exist, you're not going to see people shooting one another. You like cats. Boom. I hope. Because psychopaths. Hopefully, the baseball fans, even when they go to the extent of riotous violence, and they shouldn't. It's stupid. Our team won the championship. Let's have a riot. What kind of morons think that way? But it happens. Yeah, we won the championship. Let's flip some cars and light them on fire. That'll show our loyalty. Hopefully, you're not going to go beyond such nonsense to real hooliganism, violence, and death. We don't want that for sports teams. Let's say you love country music and hate rap, or you hate country music and love rap. I see rock music as somewhere in between those two extremes. Hopefully, we don't have the good old boys beating up the gangsters or the gangsters beating up the good old boys. Hopefully, we can each enjoy our music without having the need to kill anyone who likes the other kind of anti-music. Like there's Christ and Antichrist, there's rap and anti-rap. I don't know. Culture, and I've been hinting at this by talking about the divine and legitimacy. Those core beliefs that a culture coheres around are the things that everyone who's a part of it understands are worth living for, are worth dying for, are worth killing for. That's the level of intensity of belief that can unify a culture. So, for example, one of the values of most cultures is don't eat the long pig. Don't eat of human flesh. Do not be a cannibal. Most cultures feel that way. Intensely. And anyone who's found even contemplating cannibalism seriously is isolated in prison, punished, or killed. Because we do not want to be on the smorgasbord. We do not want to be lunch, ever. So most cultures, now in Fiji, in ancient times, and up to about 140 years ago, Bula, which is the greeting of Fiji, their version of aloha or shalom or salam. Bula is what the cannibal islands of Fiji used to say to people. And then they would capture them and kill them and eat them. Now, Fijians have not been cannibals since the British Empire put a stop to it. And it's not that the Fijians were evil, exactly, although most cultures would say cannibalism is absolutely satanically evil. It's that they lived on islands that had very limited sources of protein. And believe it or not, even though you're in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, actually in the Southwest Pacific Ocean, you cannot always count on getting enough fish. So eating people became a way for the Fijians. And they're not the only Pacific Islanders that were cannibals. Cannibalism tends to exist among Paleolithic hunter-gatherer societies. And the Fijians, in their own way, were Paleolithic hunter-gatherer societies in areas that may seem like, to us, they're full of life, like the tropical jungles of Africa or South America or Southeast Asia. But in fact, these jungles can be very difficult places to get for a human being to get protein. And we have a hunger for and a need for protein. We are not vegetarians naturally. We are omnivores. We eat both meat and vegetables. And if you can't get meat or protein any other way, well, human beings tend to be slow and weak and rather, pathetic, unless we're aware of a threat, in which case we can be really bleeping dangerous. So cannibalism is one of those things that unifies most cultures. Most cultures, absolutely anti-cannibalistic. A few cultures that tend to be Paleolithic hunter-gatherers from places where it's difficult to get protein, they tend to think that you can take the mojo of your enemies by eating them, particularly their heart. in Central Africa, there was a guy named Bokassa who thought he was the new Napoleon back in the 1960s and 70s. He led a country called the Central African Republic. This is after independence from Europe. And he decided to make it the Central African Empire. And one of the things he did, he was not alone in this in this part of the world, was to take his political enemies, kill them, and eat their hearts so that he would take their power. Most societies, no. Another idea that most cultures say is a bad idea. Do not sleep with close relatives. Do not sleep with them. Do not have children with them. Do not have relations with them. Do not involve yourself with close relatives. Why? I don't need to go into this. Most of us on a gut level understand. No! Incest! No. However, there are exceptions. For example, royal families in Egypt. In Old, Middle, and New Kingdom Egypt, the pharaonic families were believed to be living gods. As living gods, why on earth would they accept mudbloods, to use a Harry Potter term, for non-magical folk, muggle blood? Why would they accept mudbloods into the royal family? No. The way you preserve that pure god blood is you have brother and sister marry one another. You have people as close as possible who are relatives marry one another and have children. Consequently, the dynasties of Egypt quickly descended into idiocy and birth defects because genetically we understand, they didn't because they didn't understand genetics the way we do, but genetically we understand on top of any moral and ethical trauma you're going to be engaged in, you don't want to breed that close to your own genetics. The whole reason for sexual reproduction on a biological evolutionary level is to take two bloodlines and combine the strengths of both and eliminate the weaknesses of both. That's the theory behind sexual reproduction. You don't get that if you're engaged in incestuous reproduction. So the Egyptians, pharaohs did it, and they did it. Here's another example from more modern times. Young Queen Victoria in the late 1830s and 1840s was the most eligible bachelorette in Europe. She was the ruler and sovereign of the British Empire at its height of power, as it was approaching its height of power. She married her first cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. She thought he was an attractive man. He charmed her into falling in love with him because his family knew that marrying his first cousin was going to be the best thing for their family, which was a fairly minor German royal house. As a consequence of this para-incestuous marriage, first cousin's pretty darn close. Genetically, you don't want to do that. It's not like they grew up together, though. At least there was that. The royal family of Britain, which subsequently, over the next 50 years, married into every other royal family in Europe, if they were descended from Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, had a propensity towards a disease called hemophilia. Do any of you know what hemophilia is? Can any of you describe it briefly? It obviously means love of blood, but yeah.
Isn't it when they get cut or something that like they bleed a lot or they get bruises like every time they hit something?
Right. Normally, the platelets in our blood cause clotting to occur so that we don't bleed out when we get cuts. They don't have that same advantage. A hemophiliac, their blood does not clot quickly, if at all. And what that means is that if you cut yourself shaving, you could be bleeding for days and days and days and days and days. You have to bind the wound. But the fact is, it's still going to be bleeding. It's not like the wound gets quickly covered with a dry scab, which is dried blood, which is designed to sort of cork the bleeding hole. Now, let's go further. What about internal bleeding? Internal bleeding is the worst kind of bleeding because you don't know it's there. So if you have internal bleeding and you're a hemophiliac, you're at death's door every time you do that. You are at risk of dying. And you're going to suffer horrible, horrible pain. And ultimately, the crown prince of the Russian Empire has this problem. And it's one of the things that distracts the royal family, bringing in some pretty shady characters, and leads to the communist revolution there. So why does this curse befall the Victorians? Because Queen Victoria marries her first cousin. That's the origin point. It is a breeding that is way too close, and it produces birth defects. In European history, you're going to learn about the Habsburg royal family. They have this weird Habsburg lip and chin, and they look sort of like distorted comic book figures. But it's considered by members of the House of Habsburg to be a sign of royalty. He's got the Habsburg lip. He looks like a bleeping alien. Yep. It's a sign of royalty, all right, and it's because the royal family of Habsburg bred too closely with itself in order to preserve the royal power. Yeah.
Aren't you you're not supposed to marry closer than your second cousin or
Yes.
something like that?
Today, what we say is not closer than your second cousin. Even then, you're still taking a chance.
Yeah.
But the odds are not as great as first cousin or sibling or anything like that. That's just crazy. The emotional harm that people do when they pressures a relative to, no, it's bad. It's really, really bad. But most societies just know this, and therefore most societies, except when you're dealing with some kinds of royalty apparently, no, don't marry close to yourself. Second cousin at least is our stance. Now these are some cultural what are called taboos. And taboo is actually from a Polynesian language, and it means that which is unholy and forbidden. That which is unholy and forbidden. So both cannibalism and incest are taboos. They're not things we're going to politely agree to disagree about. They are unholy. They are forbidden. They are unthinkable. The culture places them outside of the pale of acceptable human activity, period. No, we're not going to discuss. No, we're not going to no, we're not going to entertain ideas that are pro-cannibal or pro-incest. So this is the sort of thing on the negative side which culture does. Here's another thing. Japanese culture prizes conformity. Why? Because the Japanese people live on some of the most dangerous land on planet Earth. They've got volcanoes, earthquakes, tidal waves, which they call tsunami. They've got forest fires. They've got mostly mountains and very limited farmland. They've got an incredibly high population. If the Japanese people don't work closely together, in harmony with one another, they're going to die. Because in a land that's that awake, that's that dangerous, people need to help one another. They need to understand one another. They need to be able to work together. And if they can do all of these things, they as a people will survive. One of the things that unifies the Japanese is their Shinto belief that they live in the land of the awakened gods and that they follow the god emperor, descendant of the sun. But another thing is just raw practicality. We have to work together. So Japanese children and teenagers learn, don't do things which are going to cause needless disruption. Don't be an individual if being an individual is going to cause people controversy, if it's going to confuse people's ability to work harmoniously with one another. Just don't be an individual if that's the case. Our society, on the other hand, we have a preference for freedom and individuality, for creativity. Here you are, a person, a human person, leading a unique life. There are many like you, but nobody is you. And what that means is, because nobody is exactly you, that you might have an idea nobody's ever thought of before. Or you may apply an old idea in a new way that nobody has ever thought of before. Now, if you have freedom, you can be creative. You can think such a thought, you can speak such a thought, you can design such a thought, you can bring such a thought to some kind of reality by making a product, by making a service, by teaching a lesson, by doing something. You, with your creative ideas and your individuality, can change the world. For the better, not for the worse, although that happens too. As a consequence, you can also pursue your own idea of God. One of the reasons that we have such broad freedoms is that the first Americans came here to avoid the religion of the king is the religion of the people, Catholic, Protestant, or Reformed. And what that means is that we, because of our founding fathers, going back to the Pilgrims, associate freedom with the ability to worship God in our own unique way, without interference. Unless our religion involves blood right sacrifice or heavily controlled drugs, the government won't get involved, shouldn't get involved, doesn't usually get involved. Because freedom, as we understand it, is the ability to think your own thoughts, to do your own thing, and to worship in your own way the truth. To worship whatever you think is the truth. To be loyal to it, to act according to it, bless you, within the broadest possible scope. If you, as an American, start questioning that, if you talk about the need to control people for their own good, if you talk about the need to restrict people's rights for the common good, you are going against the American core narrative, and you'd better have a darn good reason for it.
Does that also work in the reverse? Like the church can't infiltrate the government and try to, like, one certain church try to take over the government?
It certainly does.
Okay.
With the exception of those people that wanted to make George Washington the head of the Church of the United States, a Church of England-style Protestant official church, which Washington laughed at and said, "No! I didn't. No, not doing that." No, we in this country believe in separation of church and state. That does not mean that you can't have manger scenes on courtroom, on town square greens, or Ten Commandments on the walls of courtrooms. Our traditions are overwhelmingly Judeo-Christian. They're not Islamic, they're not Buddhist, they're not Shinto, they're not Confucian. Judeo-Christian ideas can and do inspire people in the United States and in other Western countries. Even if the people are now atheistic or agnostic or just sort of generally Christian, Judeo-Christian ideas can be normative, can be the norm. But having said that, to impose a religious belief with government power is deeply un-American. It goes absolutely against the principle of freedom. In this country, you and I are blessed to be able to think our own thoughts. This is why, to me, political correct speech codes are so bad. Because sometimes you're going to think thoughts that are not politically correct. And as an American, you should be able to think them. You should. Look, freedom of speech is for communists and racists. Freedom of speech is for everyone, even the idiots, even the morons, even the jerks. If you don't apply freedom of speech to wrong people, to tragically wrong people, to incredibly dangerously tragically wrong people, then you don't believe in free speech. Our founders did, because they assumed that common sense would prevail, and that in an environment of free speech, we could recognize those people who are tragically foolish or maliciously dangerous and shield ourselves from them. If everyone is thinking the same thing, no one is thinking. If everyone is limited in what they say, there is no free speech. And if it offends you, too bad! Being offended is one of the prices we pay for freedom. Because tolerance isn't just for people of different colors or of different sexes or of different sexualities. Tolerance is for people of different beliefs. within the broadest possible limit. So a communist can preach revolution against our republic, against our constitution. They can preach it all they want. If they start assembling bombs and using guns, at that point they're criminals. There's a difference between speech and action. Speech is something that we allow very, very broad freedom about. So for us, freedom is the core coherent belief of our culture. For the Japanese, it is the sense of living in the land of the awake gods, which is Shinto. Most cultures, by the way, have multiple core beliefs. So Christianity or Judeo-Christianity or Shinto or freedom, they all come together to form a uniqueness. Any questions or comments so far? Culture is a group of people bound together by certain core beliefs. All human societies, including Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, are cultures. They are all held together by certain beliefs. How is it that the United States is able to live the dream of Emma Lazarus, who is the poetess who wrote the poem on the Statue of Liberty? Send us your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. Send these tempest-tossed to me. I hold my light beside the golden door. That's just part of her poem. Do you understand that even in North Idaho, you have people from parts of the world that a couple hundred years ago in the old country would have happily taken out knives and spears and slaughtered one another? France versus Germany. England versus Scotland versus Ireland versus Wales. Italy versus France, or Italy versus Germany. Spain versus Portugal, or Spain versus England. Catholic versus Protestant versus Reformed. Russian versus Pole. German versus Pole. Austrian versus Pole. Austrian versus Hungarian. Swede versus Norwegian. Swede versus Finn. Russian versus Finn. I could go on. Greek versus Turk. In the old country, my ancestors, 3 generations back, hated one another. 4 generations and 5 generations back would have used that hatred and gone after one another with the intent of killing one another. I suspect it's true for most of you. So how is it that we can have in our country one society coming from such very different sources? Does anyone know or have a guess as to how the United States could pull this off and become an immigrant nation? I go with you first because you were moving your hand and it looks like it's up. And I will go to you, Emma. What might we do that permits people who hate one another like our ancestors did to come together as one people over time?
Keep strengthening relations with other countries.
That's a logical answer. By strengthening relations with other countries, we come to tolerate and respect. But as logical and sensible and reasonable as it is, it's not what we do exactly. Thank you for trying. I appreciate it. I really do. Yes.
Because people bond over trauma and oppression, and if they can form their own society, then they won't be oppressed, and they all have that same core drive.
In effect, what you're saying is that common experiences lead to a common identity. That's it. We call it the melting pot. Now, the melting pot says you can be of any kind of metal you want. We melt you all together and you come out American. Hell yeah. American. It doesn't matter what your skin color is, what your religious faith is, where your ancestors come from, what language they spoke, how much they hated one another. We're all Americans now. You know why we have public schools? We have public schools because in the late 1800s it became clear to people that we would no longer be one nation if the children of immigrants still thought like they did back in the old country. If immigrants from Ireland thought like Irishmen, if immigrants from Germany thought like Germans. Sooner or later, the United States would go, bye-bye, there it goes. Because what holds us together is a concept of freedom that actually comes from Rome and Greece and the Germans and the Christians through England. But if most people aren't of English ancestry, bye-bye freedom. So our public schools, of which this is one because you don't have to pay a tuition, that's taxpayer money. Our public schools were established with one overriding purpose, and it wasn't to teach you job skills or get you into college. It was to teach you, among other things, how to be an American. To teach you what freedom is, where it comes from, why it still exists, and how we might preserve it. Not by teaching you all to be liberals or conservatives or any faction, but to teach you civics so that you understand the Constitution and how it's applied. To teach you American history so that you understand how our republic has been challenged over the years and how it's survived and what we've done to keep freedom alive. In this school and in others, to teach the history of Western civilization, because that's where the United States comes from. But most of all, to get you to think and speak and act like young Americans. Whatever the heck that means. That's what schools are about. And so the children of Irishmen and Germans and Eastern European Jews don't think like Irishmen and Germans and Eastern European Jews. They think like Americans. They speak like Americans. Baseball, apple pie. All that stuff. It works. So long as people understand and believe that the melting pot is a good idea. Today there are some people who insist on calling such things white supremacy or white nationalism. I don't understand, honestly, the logic of it beyond the idea of using division to gin people up politically. Because it was these ideas that freed the slaves, that led to the Civil War to free the slaves. It was this idea of freedom, that applied to women, gave women the vote in 1919. This idea of universal liberty in the United States didn't start out that way, but it became that way. That's a story that's worth knowing. Anyway, that's a culture. A group of people bound together by certain core beliefs. Any questions, comments on that before we go into civilization?
Isn't white supremacy the idea that your skin tone is better than another? You're better because of your skin tone?
That's the way I always thought of it. Up until about 3 or 4 years ago, the Ku Klux Klan was white supremacist because they were completely racist. Adolf Hitler was a white supremacist because his notions were deeply racist. However, since about 2016, 2017, 2018, many people who are progressives have begun to associate any affection or loyalty for a traditional America or Western civilization. Because it originated in Europe, they interpret that now as a form of white supremacy, as if by embracing the cultures of other continents, they can make us a more perfect union. The problem is that, and I've studied it, bless you, ideas of freedom and political liberty that lead to a functioning republic do not come from South America or Africa or the Middle East or South Asia or East Asia or even Eastern Europe. They come from Western Europe. They come from the Western tradition. And if you call all of that into question, bless you, and there are tissues over there too if you need them. If you call all of that into question, because these ideas happen to come from Europe, you call the very concept of freedom as we understand it into question. So I don't understand. I admit I'm a conservative and I am limited because of that. But I try to understand the way people who disagree with me think. And beyond a certain point, I genuinely do not understand the notion that The ideas that produce the American Republic are somehow racist or white supremacist. Inherently, I don't believe it. I don't think it's structurally the case. But I don't have that belief system. That's the best answer I can give, and I'm sorry it's not good enough, because I know it's not good enough. That's all I got. Yeah?
And then I have another question, kind of on like, when the American schools were founded, they were founded to teach everyone kind of a way of like American pride and being like, hey, you're free now,
Yeah.
freedom of speech, everything.
Yep.
And so like, bringing up kind of something that's going on right now, teaching kids that because someone's different than you, they shouldn't be treated differently. Some people find that.
Yeah. Some people find the notion of meritocracy to be racist. These are the same people that said teaching math, that 2 plus 2 is 4 is objectively true, is white supremacist. What they are trying to argue is actually that objective reality, logic, and meritocracy, because they are fully described in European civilization, are somehow racist, which to me is deeply racist. It is, I grew up in schools that had mostly black and Puerto Rican kids, not white. And my attitude, one of the things that brought me into teaching, is that I believe that education is liberating. I think that people from every background and any background can learn to become a successful, fully functioning adult, to be a success. I deeply believe in that. And so those people who insist on telling what is today fashionably called children of color, that they can't get a shake in this country because they are children of color, I think is a form of child abuse. I think what you're doing is you're teaching children to hate one another, and children naturally don't hate one another. Children will notice things. They'll comment on the blackness or whiteness of somebody's skin or hair or eyes, but they don't mean anything by it. They're just being kids. They're noticing like the sky is blue and leaves are green, except in autumn when they're red or yellow or brown. To teach American children that they don't have a fair shake in a country that is more egalitarian than it has ever been, to me seems false, abusive, and self-involved, self-interested. In other words, it leads people to vote a certain way, and to me that's an abuse of politics. Politics should be about encouraging people to rise to their best impulses and do the right thing, not to beat people over the head with tribalism. You asked, I gave you my answer. What do you think before we move on?
I can kind of see where you're coming from. What I didn't really understand in that, what I didn't hear from it was when they go to school, what I heard, I don't know exactly if you meant that, but when they're going to school, it's being told that, hey, you just because of your skin color, people are going to treat you differently instead of everyone tries their best.
Well, critical race theory divides people by race. And critical race theory is pretty thoroughly ingrained in most educational programs today. The idea that America is structurally racist. The idea that people of color cannot get a fair shake because they're people of color. The idea that the government needs to intervene and reallocate resources strictly on the basis of race in order to equalize or compensate for past inequities, in order to destroy white privilege. These are all involved in a lot of schools today, and they are, to me, profoundly racist. Because what they teach kids is not you are yourself, but you are a member of a tribe. And that being a member of a particular tribe, you're going to be treated a certain way, and it won't be fairly. So what we need to do is we need to bring justice to what had been an unfair system. And that kind of revolutionary zeal, first of all, pigeonholes kids into thinking racially rather than individually. And it causes some kids to give up on dreams because in an unfair country, why dream big dreams? That's a horrible thing to take from a kid. Go on, if I'm still not answering your question.
Thank you.
Okay. I'm not sure what you were asking. I hope I got somewhere in the area. If nothing else, in the blast zone of my mental grenade.
Thank you.
What?
You did answer it, thank you.
Okay, good. Now we come to a civilization. And you're going to want to write this down. A civilization is a culture with A civilization is a culture with cities, comma, specialized labor, comma, writing, comma, high technology. Yeah. High technology, comma, complex institutions. So a civilization is a culture with cities, with specialized labor. I'm going to go over all of these things in detail. With writing, with high technology, and with complex institutions. So, my Irish ancestors were a culture, not a civilization, because while they had towns, they did not have cities. The Lakota Sioux, North American Plains Indians, who conquered the Black Hills of South Dakota, are a culture, not a civilization, because they were hunter-gatherers and nomadic. They did not root themselves in cities. The Montagnard people of Vietnam are a culture, not a civilization, because they are a jungle folk and a mountain folk who lived in tribes and at most in occasional towns, not in cities. So, cities seem to be the basic difference between a culture and a civilization. The English are a civilization as opposed to the Irish, because the English have cities. The Pueblos, actually I should say, because they had towns, the Aztecs and the Incas were civilizations, as opposed to the Lakota Sioux that were not, because the Aztecs and the Incas had cities. The Vietnamese and the Cambodians were civilizations because they had cities. The Mongols are a culture. The Chinese are a civilization. So, all civilizations are cultures, but not all cultures are civilizations. All civilizations are cultures, but not all cultures are civilizations. All civilizations are cultures, but not all cultures are civilizations. So we start out with one of the 5 requirements of a civilization. And the word civilization is from the Latin civitas, which means city. Civics comes from the same root. The way you keep a city civilization running. So, what is a city? I have a definition for you. A city is any settlement so large, I'm saying it this way because writing it down is not a bad idea. A city is any settlement that is so large that if trade broke down, most people would die. A settlement so large that if trade broke down, most people would die. Cities are settlements so large that if trade broke down, most people would die. If trade broke down, most people would die. Okay, let's see what that means. Let's say, God forbid, power goes out, never comes back on, not in our lifetimes. If the power goes out, we have no electrical power, we have no electric doodads or toys, we have no electric heat or air conditioning, cars won't work because they rely on an electric battery, and most modern cars have computers. No computer's going to work, no radio or television transmission is going to work, no telephone or internet is going to work, no electronics. We are back to the 1800s. But we're worse than the 1800s. Because in the 1800s, they had been building their way towards a mechanized society that didn't use electricity. We have turned all of our mechanization into something that requires electronics. So suddenly, most people need to find another way of providing food, or they're going to die. Now, if you take Idaho in isolation, we have so many people who are effective hunters, fishermen, farmers, and ranchers. We have so many crops and livestock as a state that even without electricity, if we were left alone, most people, most places in Idaho would be fine. Because we could spread out across the countryside. Those people who knew how to farm would end up being in charge. Those people who didn't know how to farm would end up working on their farms. People would die, but most people would probably survive. Now, whether Coeur d'Alene or the greater Boise area, which as I understand it are the largest conurbations in the state, maybe, Twin Falls also, whether the really big city centers, no, they wouldn't be able to survive as they are. The people of those cities would have to spread out across the countryside. But if we had the area of Idaho and we were not going to be invaded by anyone, we could do it. If we were stuck within our municipalities, Rathdrum and Hayden would probably survive. Coeur d'Alene and Post Falls might not. Boise and Meridian and all that area down there would probably not. Too many people on too small patches of land. However, we're not alone. We have a city of 600,000 just 30 miles to the west of us in Spokane. And those people would be spreading out into our region as well as into theirs because Idaho has better land than most of eastern Washington. And right across the Cascades, we have however many millions of people are in Seattle and in Portland. They would inevitably sweep east and we'd have to fight them. Or retreat in front of them, or be enslaved by them, or destroyed by them. If trade were to break down, most people would die. That's the definition of a city. If you look at the number of people per square mile in Athol, or Athol, however it's pronounced, if the electricity went out, there'd be plenty of room for people in Athol to find a way to stay alive, if they had the skills. My old neighborhood in the Bronx, most everyone would die. Because my old neighborhood in the Bronx had precious little land. Everything had been built upon, had concrete upon it. There were a few trees and bushes that were manicured like gardens. Way too many people, unless they spread out into the countryside, they would die. Like that. So, cities. The other thing that cities do is that cities force people to solve problems. Here's a problem. How do you get fresh water to so many people? The Romans come up with the best solution, up until modern times, aqueducts. You have piping above the ground so high that most people can't poison it. And these aqueducts bring fresh mountain water to your cities. And there are public fountains that everyone can use. There are public baths that everyone can use. There are public toilets that everyone can use. And the rich have their own water piped in. That's a good system. That's better than anyone else in the ancient world. If you doubt the importance of sewers, try imagining what a city, or baths, try imagining what a city with a few tens of thousands of people smells like in the summertime without sewers or baths. Not pleasant. Very bad. Stinky, stinky. And that's just one of the problems that cities help us to solve. Here's another. We're irritating. We irritate one another. The natural response to an irritant is to get them away from you. But you're stuck there, crowded. So then what do? You have the Old West solution. You got a gunfighter who's sleeping, drink after having drank too much alcohol, and the guy on the other side of this cheapo hotel is snoring loudly. Shut up! Boom, boom, boom. Stop snoring! Boom, boom, boom. And the guy keeps snoring. So the gunfighter grabs his gun and goes boom, 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 boom. Kills the guy. Goes back to sleep. Why? Because it's the Old West and the guy was snoring. How do we avoid death in the streets? Somebody bumps into you, doesn't say sorry. Do you knife him? Somebody's sitting at a table across from you and belches loudly. You can smell it. Oh, God, it's disgusting. Do you knife him? I mean, on some level, I could see you wanting to just because, how dare you? How dare you? How dare you? But we don't do that. So when we come back tomorrow, we will talk about the benefits of cities and how they help us to solve problems. Any questions, comments, or thoughts? I thank you for the questions today and the comments and the discussion. You may speak quietly among yourselves until dismissal.